and welcome to our community. Susie Thomas continuing Adoption Month week with you this morning. We've got Kenny Crookston and Pat Hill. They're both from Job and Family Services. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing well, thank you, and thank you for being here. We've heard some amazing stories this week so far.
Absolutely.
Now let's get to the nuts and bolts, because I know you've got stories as well, but you also can give us some real, tangible, and great things to do if we are hearing these stories and being moved to adopt, perhaps moved to foster to adopt, or just even to think or even pray about it a little bit more. So let's hear about this. First of all, Job and Family Services, how does that work into adoption, or where does adoption fall under the auspices of Job and Family Services?
Well, our agency at Stark County, we are a triple combined agency. So we have our child support, our human services division, and our children's services division as well. And so as part of the Children's Services Division, what we do is, I always tell my kids when they ask me what I do for a living, my job is to keep kids safe.
Yeah.
Keep kids safe and try and help and support families. And so when we're out and we are in the process of doing our day-to-day work and we're working with families and supporting families and working with children, sometimes it's not always necessary, or it's not always we're not always able to maintain the children in the home where they're living.
But that would be the ideal, right? Every time. That's what the goal is,
Absolutely.
If it's possible.
Yeah. Reunification.
Yeah, maintaining those kids in the home or reunification is always our goal, whenever it's possible. And even when children have to be removed from their home for whatever reason, it's our goal is to get those children back into that home as quickly as possible. Making sure that there's visits happening with those families, making sure that there's, if there's family support or other supports that those families are engaged with, we want to make sure that's all happening. So,
you think of siblings in those kind of situations. It seems that it would be really important to keep siblings together, if at all possible. Talk about that a bit.
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of that conversation as well. Whether they're in foster care, whether they're living with relatives, or whether they're in our permanent custody, maintaining those bonds and those relationships is of the utmost importance. Not every no family looks the same. Your family doesn't look the same as mine, or anything like that. So, you may have different generations living in the same home. You may have children with different mothers or different fathers living in the same home. But those relationships are all extremely important to who those children, who those families are. So we want to do everything we can to maintain those relationships and make sure that they're visiting as much as possible.
Yesterday's program, we heard a stunning statistic. I believe the number that she threw out was 100,000 children right now across the United States are completely free to be adopted. They have no ties. They don't belong to a family. They are in the system and ready to be adopted. What is the need, even more locally? Can you help us?
So with Stark County, we are looking at slightly over 100 children being available for adoption at this time. And in our permanent custody, we are recruiting for those families and always looking for families available to adopt them, and sibling groups. Sometimes there are sibling groups.
What age groups are we talking about, Pat?
We are talking about birth all the way up to 18. This year we've had a phenomenal amount of adoptions of older youth, 18 and older, that are still in our custody. So it's infinite. Adoption it can happen for anybody. So it's not just the little babies. We're talking about, birth, 2-year-old, 3-year-olds, 14-year-olds, and 18-year-olds.
Recently was at a cookout, actually, and heard the story. There was a young man there and a lovely young girl there as well. They found out about a year ago that they were siblings. He knew he was adopted. She actually had aged out of the foster care program. And it turned out great, which she's a real success story of excellent foster care. But boy, they would have loved to have known that they were brother and sister before now, and now they consider each other family. She's invited to family events with his adoptive family. How does that happen, and what can we do to prevent something like that?
So we really try hard to make sure that sibling connections are maintained from the time children come into our custody, even before permanent custody. And then after permanent custody, we try to make sure that those connections. So one child may be adopted by one family and another by another, but we make sure they have the information and that they keep those bonds together.
And I'm wondering about the adoptive parents, too. More than likely, if they knew that their child had a sibling, they probably would at least consider keeping them together, yes?
More often than not, they will try to keep them together. And all the time we have families that are willing to take on another child just to keep the children together. Sometimes that is impossible, but they continue visitations throughout the life of the children.
What would be a situation where that would not be the ideal? I have heard abuse. If children are born into an abusive home, sometimes they just have trouble with boundaries, and it's better that they are raised individually. Anything else you want to talk about there?
I think that there's times where, there could be a sibling that may have been born 7-8 years after another one was born. And so, and maybe the family that had stepped forward and I'm assuming a lot of this story, but maybe a family that stepped forward for that older child wasn't able to, for whatever reason. Maybe they had too many of their own children, or had some other family issues going on. So that could be a reason why maybe a family wasn't able to keep siblings together. But like Pat said, we'll do everything we can. We try to keep the best notes as possible and make sure that people are notified and contact people and try to do whatever we can to maintain those relationships, because we're aware. We see it all the time. We're aware of what those relationships and what those siblings and just what that means to those children that we're working with.
Let's address some concerns. I think a lot of things that you hear are, it's expensive, we could not afford to adopt a child. That would be one. Let's talk about that. What about the costs involved, the financial costs involved, and how can a family prepare for that? How do you address those kinds of objections?
Well, because we are a public agency, there is no cost to the family. They will come, they'll go through our pre-service training, which is 36 hours of training. We will do their licensure, which would include a home study assessment of who they are, get references, background checks, but there is no cost to the family whatsoever.
Say that again, because I don't think people realize that. They think that it's hundreds of thousands of dollars to adopt a child.
And there are instances, like if you're adopting privately or adopting internationally, and I don't know all the ins and outs of the costs but I know that, internationally and privately, that there is sometimes larger cost that goes along with that. The youth that we're talking about and the families that we're licensing, these are for youth that are in our agency's custody that are with us because of, like Pat was saying earlier before we came on air, this is no fault of their own. This is a circumstance that their family was dealing with, and for whatever the reason, they're in our agency's permanent custody, and we are responsible for finding them a permanent and forever home. And so we want to get those families that are interested licensed, approved, support them with our staff as best possible, and match them with children that are appropriate for their family, and that's appropriate for the children that we're working with, because that's the biggest. Obviously, that's the most important thing, is if there's a child that's moving into a home, is this the right home for this child?
Right.
But we want to do everything we can to make sure that happens.
Another objection might be we have our birth children. We're not sure about what that would do to the balance of the family if we bring in another child. Adopting, first of all, it is a family affair, is it not?
It is.
And birth children really need to kind of be on board if this is going to be happening. But can you alleviate those fears a bit?
I mean, I would say that there's always going to be unknown. But the best way to alleviate that is to have those open conversations. You said it better than anybody. I think I could probably say it. It's a family endeavor. You have to be open and honest with your entire family, with your kids, with even with your parents, with your relatives, your brothers and sisters that you may be calling on to babysit or to help out. It really is. It takes. I'm not going to be cliche and say it takes a village, but I'll be a cliche and say it takes a village. I mean, it takes all those people to support a family, and I think it needs to be an open and honest conversation with everybody to do it.
Last thing that's on some people's mind: what if the birth parents change their minds. And we have already bonded with this baby. I can't imagine a bigger nightmare than having a child that you've grown to love just be ripped away from you. I think that stops some people. Can you talk about that?
I would say that when we license families for foster care and for adoption. And when children are in I think we started out talking about foster care and what our goals are, and trying to reunify kids with families first and foremost, no matter what, and how it's our responsibility to work with those families, to encourage them, to help those birth parents, help those birth families, support them. But it's also our agency's responsibility to support and help our foster homes who may be going through difficult times during that transition. It's not easy, and I think we have to recognize that. There's always going to be some grief. We rely on our foster homes to give everything that they have, to invite these kids into their home and support them and love them and make them part of their home. Mm-hmm. And when they leave, sometimes it is hard. It's hard to look back and, I think at times, and say, look at all that you've been able to do, and if not for all of the work and support of that foster home, maybe that child doesn't get back in with their parents. And there's such love and support and just work that you can't expect out of just anybody, and there's hard work done. But I think we have to, as an agency, look back and realize that, boy, that's hard, and it can take an emotional toll. And so we need to be able to be aware of how we support those families and kind of work through that process.
What kinds of things are available for those parents? We talked to a mom this week that had fostered babies, and then they were able to be reunited with their birth parents. So she would foster them as a safe landing place, and then they would go home. But she knew she was putting herself into experience grief after grief after grief as you've bonded with a baby and now they're leaving you. So what kinds of things do you offer parents who are fostering, who know that this is not going to be permanent?
Well, I think that there is that grief, and that's sad. And I think part of it is maybe working. We have our resource managers that work with all of our licensed homes, and working with those families to maybe rebrand that grief into success. You empower those families. You help that child to bring it back together, and that's fantastic. We're also in November beginning a foster parent support group, where we're going to really try to work with a lot of our homes and our foster parents, and give it a spot where we can be open and honest and talk with each other. Foster parents can bring forward their questions or concerns, and agency staff can do the same with those foster homes in a supportive and safe environment where we can kind of grow as a team. I think we haven't done this for quite some time. I think it's something that we're really going to benefit from. So I think just even having that is going to be a nice support for our foster homes and adoptive homes.
It's a great idea. I have a friend who is getting into fostering, and she said, I spent the weekend with 2 teenage girls, and I said, on purpose? I mean, who would do that? But this is what she's really wanting to do. Right. And so, wonderful to have some support there to kind of give. Can you imagine diving straight into teenage? With girls?
No.
Well, me neither. No, that takes a special kind of gal.
It does, and we are lucky where we have some homes and some families that we work with that do take on that challenge and do it like you wouldn't believe. And there's times where we'll have to call those families in an emergency situation, and there's a teenager maybe that comes into our agency's care for whatever reason, and it's funny having foster homes that you call. And they answer the phone. You tell them the story and kind of give them the information. They're like, "Oh yes, please, bring them along." And I hang up the phone sometimes and just shake my head. I'm like, "Thank goodness for these people. They're incredible, and just their willingness to support some of these children and support our agency. It's
incredible.
It's incredible.
Yeah. We're visiting with Kenny Crookston, Pat Hill. They are from Job and Family Services, all talking about adoption this week. We're going to take a short break. Be back with you in just a moment. You're listening to Our Community.